I thought it was going to be a great day when I pulled into the parking lot with my brand new car. But then I saw her, and I knew something was about to go down. Here's how it all went down. It was a sunny afternoon when I pulled into the parking lot of the shopping center. I had just bought a brand new car for $10,000, and I was excited to show it off to my friends. I parked the car in the lot and got out, admiring the sleek lines and shiny paint job. As I was standing there, taking it all in, I noticed a woman and a young boy walking toward me. The woman was middle-aged and had a smug look on her face. The boy was around 10 years old and was carrying a ball. I didn't think much of them at first, but as they got closer, I started to feel a sense of unease. The woman was laughing and pointing at my car, and the boy was grinning mischievously. Suddenly, the boy threw the ball at my car, causing it to bounce off the hood with a loud thud. I was furious. I turned to the woman and demanded to know what was going on. She just laughed and said it was just a prank. I didn't find it funny at all. I had just spent a lot of money on this car, and I didn't want it to be damaged. I told her to stop, but she just kept laughing and filming me with her phone. I was starting to get really angry, but I tried to stay calm and explain to her that what she was doing was not okay. At this point, I had completely forgotten about my friends and the reason I had come to the shopping center in the first place. All I could think about was this woman and her annoying behavior. Karen just wouldn't stop laughing. She kept saying things like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you fell for that," and "You're such an easy target, I couldn't resist." I was getting really pissed off. I mean, who does she think she is? It wasn't like I had done anything to her. I was just minding my own business, showing off my new car to my friends. But Karen didn't seem to care. She just kept egging me on, saying things that she knew would make me angry. It was like she was getting some sick pleasure out of it. And to make matters worse, her son was there too, watching the whole thing with a big grin on his face. At first, I tried to be civil. I told her that what she was doing wasn't funny and that she needed to stop. But she just laughed and said that I was taking it too seriously. "It's just a prank, bro," she kept saying. "Lighten up." But I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I mean, she had thrown a ball at my car. Who does that? So I started to get more forceful with her. I told her that she was being immature and that she needed to grow up, but she just laughed and said that I was the one who needed to grow up. At this point, my friends were starting to get involved too. They could see that I was getting really angry and they didn't want things to escalate any further. But Karen didn't seem to care. She just kept pushing my buttons, saying things that she knew would get a rise out of me. And then, things got really heated. Karen said something about how I was lucky to even have a car, and that I should be grateful for the attention her prank had brought me. That was the last straw. I lost it. I started yelling at her, telling her that she had no right to talk to me like that. I think I might have even cursed at her. I was so angry. Looking back on it now, I probably should have just walked away. But in the moment, I was so furious that I couldn't think straight. All I could think about was how this woman had disrespected me and my property, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I was so angry that I could barely see straight. This woman had just thrown a ball at my brand new car and was now laughing in my face. I couldn't believe it. I tried to stay calm, but she kept pushing my buttons, saying things that she knew would make me angry. "You think this is funny?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You think it's okay to throw a ball at someone's car?" Karen just laughed. "It was just a prank, bro," she said. "Lighten up." I couldn't believe she was still laughing. I mean, what kind of person throws a ball at a stranger's car and then laughs about it? I was getting more and more angry with each passing second. "You don't understand," I said, trying to explain to her why this was such a big deal. "I just bought this car. I spent a lot of money on it. I don't want it to get damaged." But Karen just rolled her eyes. "Oh, please," she said. "It's just a car. Get over it." I was starting to lose my temper. "No, you get over it," I said. "You can't just go around throwing things at people's property and expect them to be okay with it." Karen just laughed again. "You're such an easy target," she said. I couldn't resist. That was it. I had had enough. I lunged at Karen, grabbing her by the shoulders. "You think this is funny?" I yelled. "You think it's okay to disrespect me and my property like this?" Karen looked a little scared now, but she still managed to keep a smirk on her face. "What are you going to do about it?" she said. "Call the cops?" I didn't know what I was going to do about it, but I knew I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I was seething with anger. "You're going to pay for this," I said. "You're going to pay for what you did to me and my car." Karen just laughed again. "Good luck with that," she said. That was when I saw red. I don't know what came over me, but I just lost it. I started to pummel her with my fists, hitting her in the face and chest. She tried to fight back, but I was too strong for her. I kept hitting her, over and over again, until she finally fell to the ground. I stood over her, panting and sweating. I couldn't believe what I had just done. I had never been in a fight before, and I had never hit anyone before. But there was something about this woman that just pushed me over the edge. Karen lay on the ground, moaning and holding her face. I knew I had gone too far, but I couldn't bring myself to care. "That's what you get," I said, taking one last swing at her before walking away. After the confrontation with Karen, I was still shaking with anger. I couldn't believe how rude and entitled she had been. My friends and I got into the car and started to drive away, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of frustration and irritation. As we were driving, my friend Mike tried to lighten the mood. "Dude, don't worry about that crazy lady," he said. "She was obviously just trying to get a rise out of you." I knew he was right, but I still couldn't help feeling angry. "I just can't believe people like that exist," I said. "Who goes around throwing things at other people's property and then laughs about it?" My other friend Sarah chimed in. "I know, right?" she said. "But you showed her. You proved that your car is worth something and that she was wrong to mess with it." I appreciated their support, but I still couldn't shake off the feeling of anger and frustration. I felt like I had been violated in some way, like my personal space had been invaded by this entitled woman and her son. As we drove back to my apartment, I started to calm down a bit. I realized that I had let my anger get the best of me, and that I had probably overreacted a little bit. But at the same time, I couldn't help feeling like Karen had deserved what she got. When we got back to my apartment, I started to think about what had happened. I realized that I had been so focused on Karen and her behavior that I had forgotten about why I had come to the shopping center in the first place. I had wanted to show off my new car to my friends, but instead, I had gotten into a fight with a crazy lady. But despite all of that, I was still glad that I had stood up for myself and my property. I knew that I couldn't let people like Karen get away with behaving like entitled bullies. I can't believe some people can be so entitled and disrespectful. Props to him for standing up for himself and his property. I hope Karen learned her lesson and won't be pulling any more pranks like that in the future. I'll begin by saying that I, 25M, come from a very well-known West African country, and I come from one of the 3 major ethnic groups in my country. My country has a lot of oil, and my father, 64M, is an engineer who worked for a very big oil company here before he retired a few years ago. He's the second of 3 children. Due to his job, salary, and position within the company, he became the entire family's breadwinner. His elder brother had 7 children with his wife, and his younger brother had 2 children with his late wife, and my father trained each and every one of them. He sent them all to school through their nursery to primary and secondary schools, and when they all graduated from high school, he gave each of them the option of either going to a higher institution or helping them start up a business of their own. Every Christmas, we'd travel to the village, and he'd buy multiple 50 kg bags of rice, bags of beans, tons of groceries, specially dried fishes, and so much more. And he'd distribute this to the entire family, aunts, uncles, etc. He catered for his siblings, cousins, old friends in the village, as well as their respective families so much. And it sometimes offended my mother because while he took excellent care of us, and she was never against him helping his siblings out, she felt he was making them overly dependent on him. He opened a thriving business for his elder brother's wife and stocked up her business with all the necessary wares, and he did the same for his younger brother. And yet whenever they had a problem, they'd choose to call him instead of solving even the most basic problems by themselves. This is all a preamble to show you that he really cared for his family. This involves my father's elder brother's wife, we'd call Rita, and her eldest son we'd call Chris. Rita is a woman in her 50s, and Chris is in his mid-30s. When Chris was born, his mother despised him, because given our tradition and culture, she felt like his pregnancy forced her into a marriage she did not want, so she took out her frustration on him. When he was 11, my mother was a newlywed, and on one of her trips accompanying my dad to the village, she saw how Rita physically abused her son, which is pretty common here under the guise of discipline. And out of fear for his safety, my parents asked his father to let them take Chris with them back to the city, so they could, in a sense, foster him as their own, to remove him from that abusive environment. I was barely a year old at this point. Chris lived with us for roughly 18 years. He got a good education, and when it was time to go to the university, he had a lot of problems gaining admission. In my country, all the universities, both state and federal, are under an organization, and everyone takes an annual national exam based on your intended course of study, and those who do the best are admitted into their institution of choice. He'd taken this exam for about 6 years, and each time he'd fallen short and hadn't received an admission. So my dad gave him the option to continue trying or to put it on hold and learn a good trade for about a year. And after that, he'd open a business for him, and maybe he could try getting into the university later on if he still wanted. He chose the latter option, and he was sent off to another city to stay with a family friend who taught him all he needed to know about the given business for free, and after a year, he returned home. My father gave him what is equivalent to $12K to begin a business. Over here, $12K is a very, very big chunk of money, especially with the low cost of living here compared to our Western counterparts, and also especially how lax our tax laws are here. My dad offered him a check for that amount, and he refused it, saying how small the money was. My dad had already found a really good space for him to run his business and had paid and rented it out for 2 years for him, as well as paying his water and electric bills. The $12K was an initial capital for him to stock up on his wares without having to worry about rent or any critical expenses for 2 years at least. All he had to do was simply make sales and bring in profit so that after 2 years, he could afford to take on the expenses on his own, because he probably would have saved quite a bit of money in the time. And even if he did have difficulties, knowing my dad, he would have jumped in to help. However, Chris rejected the money, saying how small it was, and he was expecting at least $17K. That although the space my dad had rented for him was in a prime location, that it was too small for him, and that he had found a much bigger space a few blocks away, and he expected my dad to pay for that as well. He said he had big ideas and didn't want my dad to repress his ideas, so he needed the appropriate support. My mother just about lost her head hearing this and chastised him about how ungrateful he was being. She asked him how many people were willing to do the things my dad had done for him. She asked him why he couldn't use this fund as an initial capital and begin his business and strive to make it successful so that he could afford to move into that bigger space after the 2 years lease was up. He got upset and called his mother, with whom relations had improved significantly over the years, and she tore my dad a new one. She screamed in our native language about how, after the stress he must have been under by not getting into the university, the least you can do is make sure this dream of his is nurtured fully. Why are you being a jerk? You have the money, so just do as he asks in the way that he asks. If you died today, would they bury you with your money? You're not setting a good example as his uncle. Tufiakwa, which basically means God forbid. My father did not respond and promptly ended the call. Later on, his dad, my father's brother, called him, and I don't know what was said. But after that, he came and picked up the check where he'd previously dropped it and muttered a half-assed thank you before leaving. My dad also received a call from his brother, apologizing for his behavior. Fast forward 2 years, and this was now 2016. I was 18, 19, and my immediate younger sister, 12F, was now in secondary school, and my other siblings were also in primary school. So the financial burden on my dad was quite a lot during this time. So he called Chris and had a talk with him. This was sometime in October, and my dad said that since Chris's business was going well, perhaps it was time for him to move out from our home, maybe by the new year, so that the financial constraints could be alleviated a bit. Now, mind you, Chris had lived with us for 18 years since I was barely a year old, and he was 11/12 years old, and now I was 18, 19 years old. So he was about 29, 30 years old now. He never paid rent for 1 day or paid for utilities. My dad always did. He never bought his food or groceries either. My dad did that too for almost 2 decades that he lived with us. When my dad asked him to move out, he said nothing and, like before, called his mother. I have no idea what was said, but she called my dad in a fury that evening, screaming her head off about how my dad has never really cared about her son's success and brought up the $12K incident from a few years earlier. She said something along the lines of, "You want him to leave your house while your wife's sister is still living with you. This is how little you care about your brother and his family. My son doesn't need you or your charity. My God will help him to survive with or without you," and so on. The wife's sister, she referred to, was a young niece of my mom's, who had lost her parents to militant actions in one of our cities, and she was barely 15 at that time. After that call, he packed his things and was gone in a few weeks. This was 2016, and I haven't seen or heard from him since then. They view my dad as a bad person for not giving him the amount of money he wanted, and for asking him, a 30-year-old man with a thriving business, to move out. This is nothing in the grand scheme of things. There are more cases of entitlement in my family, and it's really baffling. Now, let me talk about EM and S. EM is my dad's cousin and in her 60s. She had 6 children with her late husband, all within the age range of late 20s to early 50s. Her son, whom this story revolves around, is in his early 40s now. In 2009, ES lived in the village with EM, where he ran a fairly successful pineapple farm business. Then, there were allegations levied against him by the family of the deceased that he had killed their relative. The police were involved, and they found no incriminating evidence. However, the deceased's family was angry and sought to take justice into their hands. They planned to have him killed, and this frightened EM. She called my dad one day in 2009 and begged him to let ES live with us in the city far away from the village because she feared that if he remained in the village, he was going to be killed. My dad, not wanting to see her lose her child, agreed to help him, and so ES arrived at our home in early 2009. He was in his early 30s at that point. Upon arriving, he got a job at a bar and grill fast food restaurant where he worked for about a year or two before my dad helped him get a decent job at an insurance firm. He had an entire room and bathroom all to himself and never paid rent or utilities. He never paid for his food or bought his groceries. Whenever an appliance broke at home, my dad would replace it, and ES would take the broken one. From flat-screen TVs, refrigerators, bed and mattress, etc., my dad let him take them all. He had them fixed and gave them to his sisters who had just moved to our city. My dad took care of him and his needs as though he was his own child. My mom wasn't exactly thrilled about him moving in with us in the beginning because it was so sudden, but given the life and death nature of the situation, she accepted it. When my dad retired a few years later and got his gratuity, he assisted most of our extended family financially, and in that spirit, he gave ES a check for what amounts to roughly $6K to help him out, and he was really thankful about it because he said he'd never been gifted such an amount of money before, and he didn't think people were that generous. We lived in relative bliss until 2016 when my dad's financial issues began. Around that period of time, we did struggle a lot. Most days, there was no food at home. And to his credit, ES used a part of his savings to assist the family back then. But it was never free. However, it didn't really matter because in that moment, without that assistance, we'd probably have starved. He'd buy food items and groceries and also lend my dad some money. All these expenses were always repaid every few weeks when my dad received some money because the assistance received from ES were loans, and you always pay your debts, and secondly because my dad didn't expect ES, who was also struggling and figuring things out too, to cater to the family. Things generally continued this way until 2018 when there was a resurgence in the real estate market in my country. My dad was finally able to sell both properties for around low six figures each. That influx of cash pushed us out of the red into a more comfortable position. After the sale, my dad's first major purchase was a car because we'd sold both of our cars during those difficult years. There weren't a lot of people who came to our aid during that period. So as a way to show gratitude, my dad gave ES a check for about $5K to $6K. Now, this is where the entitlement began. ES knew how much both properties sold for, so shortly after my dad bought the car, ES came to him with an itemized list informing my dad that he had decided to go back to the agricultural sector. He wanted to start another pineapple farm, but not just pineapples, but he also wanted to grow oranges as well. As a male child, he had inherited some plots of land in the village after his father died. He planned on using that land for the business. By this time, it had been almost a decade since he fled from the village, and most of the pressure and threats had died down, so he felt safe returning. Besides, he wasn't actually going to be living there since he still had his job in the city. He simply wanted to set it up and have his mother run it for him. He had already discussed his plans with his mother, and she was excited about the idea, and then he handed my dad a list of everything needed to pull this off, and he needed an initial capital of what amounts to roughly $29,400 from my dad to begin. My dad was stunned. He asked him if he realized just how much he was asking for. My dad said that if he had even saved up a fraction of that continuation, now, this is where the entitlement began. ES knew how much both properties sold for, so shortly after my dad bought the car, ES came to him with an itemized list informing my dad that he had decided to go back to the agricultural sector. He wanted to start another pineapple farm, but not just pineapples, but he also wanted to grow oranges as well. As a male child, he had inherited some plots of land in the village after his father died. He planned on using that land for the business. By this time, it had been almost a decade since he fled from the village, and most of the pressure and threats had died down, so he felt safe returning. Besides, he wasn't actually going to be living there since he still had his job in the city. He simply wanted to set it up and have his mother run it for him. He had already discussed his plans with his mother, and she was excited about the idea. Then he handed my dad a list of everything needed to pull this off, and he needed an initial capital of what amounts to roughly $29,400 from my dad to begin. My dad was stunned. He asked if he realized just how much he was asking for. My dad said that if he had even saved up a fraction of that money by himself, then maybe he'd have been willing to see what he could do. But he expected my dad to pay for everything, which wasn't okay, given that all four of my younger siblings were in boarding school, which was kind of expensive. He was also making college plans for them as well, so he wasn't in a position where he could just give out almost $30K just like that. This annoyed ES, so he asked my dad to loan him the money instead. But again, my dad refused to do that because there was no guarantee that he could make back that money in a year from a startup business. My dad offered him 10%, $3K, of what he asked for free to try and help him. But that wasn't good enough for him. I can't forget the statement he made when my dad said no, nor can I forget his tone. He said, "So, you say you won't give me this money? Okay, no problem. And then he stormed out. He didn't care about my dad's reasons or my siblings' well-being. All he cared about was himself. This was on a Tuesday, mind you. On Saturday, his mother came to our house unannounced from the village. Neither she nor ES had informed my parents that she was coming. The things she said that day, she unleashed every ounce of resentment she had for him. Prior to this, he'd always looked upon her as the sister he never had and treated her as such. We just had lunch that afternoon when ES went to pick her up from wherever she got dropped. She went on a tirade. She began by telling him that what he was doing was wrong. Is this fair? You sold the properties for hundreds of thousands of dollars, so what is $29K? She asked. You have forgotten how ES supported you when you were struggling. You have forgotten how he spent his salary on you and your children every month. And now you cannot even help him with this small thing even though you have the money. She said all this in front of my dad, mom, me, ES, and my young siblings. My mom sent my siblings to their rooms because it was no atmosphere for children. I can't remember everything she said, but I do remember this part. You have also forgotten about the numerous times when I used to bathe and clean your mother. My grandmother had dementia during the latter years of her life. Unlike in Western countries, the concept of housing for senior citizens isn't very popular here. So instead, the family usually takes care of their own. My dad viewed her as his sister, so he asked her to please look after my grandmother for him since he was in the city, and she and my grandmother were both in the village. My dad visited every month and ensured that they weren't lacking for anything. He gave her monetary gifts or food items, etc., as a way to say thank you. So while she was, in fact, helping him, my dad did show constant financial appreciation until my grandmother passed. Through her tirade, my dad said nothing. He is extremely quiet and hates conflict, but my mom is the exact opposite. She doesn't take nonsense from anyone. When she brought up my late grandmother, my mom raised her voice and began to chastise her about her behavior and began pointing out every single detail of the extent my dad had gone to help ES. Do you think your son would be alive today had my husband not agreed to let him move in with us? She said this while pointing at ES. Weren't they after his head after the allegations made against him? She asked. How many people have given you $6K not once but twice free of charge? How many people would open their home to someone who is suspected of murder? But my husband did it because he loves and values his family above almost anything. Yes, ES helped us out when things were really bad, and I'm thankful, but he was always repaid in full. She continued. Do you not care about him training his own children? If he gives you that money, do you not see how that would disrupt the plans he's made for his own kids? How can you both be this selfish? She asked. How dare you come into our home and raise your voice at the man who has protected, fed, and housed your son for a decade? She continued. How dare you bring his late mother into this? When you took care of her, did you receive nothing in return? He never provided for you financially or looked after you while housing and taking care of your son as well? This shut EM up. So much more was said, which I can't remember before my mom asked EM to leave. To show you just how little shame he had, ES continued to live with us for a few months before eventually moving out. My dad refused to ask him to leave because he knew ES was already making plans to leave. When all this went down, ES was in his late 30s, so he was old enough to know better. To this day, my dad never lets any member of my extended family visit. He often wonders where exactly he went wrong, or what heinous crime he committed against them. It always upsets me whenever he talks about these events because of just how much pain it still causes him to this day. It's crazy how entitled some people can be, especially when it comes to family. I can't believe ES expected his uncle to just hand over almost $30K like it was nothing. And EM's behavior towards the end is just shameful. Props to the dad for taking care of everyone for so long, but it's sad to see how little appreciation he gets from some of his family members.